Imagine being a German soldier, captured in the heat of battle, expecting the worst. Torture, starvation, maybe even execution. But instead you're handed a menu, not just any menu. A choice between roast beef, fried chicken, or pork chops. You think it's a cruel joke, but it's not. What happened next shocked over 400,000 German prisoners of war so deeply that many never wanted to return home. Today, we're diving into one of World War II's most incredible untold stories. What German POWs discovered in American prison camps that completely shattered everything they believed about their enemies. The year is 1943. The Third Reich has been feeding its people a steady diet of propaganda about the barbaric Americans, telling them that capture meant certain death or, at best, brutal torture in concentration camps. German soldiers were taught that Americans were savage, inferior beings who would show no mercy to prisoners. But what actually happened when hundreds of thousands of German soldiers found themselves behind American barbed wire tells a completely different story. A story so shocking that it would fundamentally change how these men viewed not just America, but their own country and everything they had been fighting for. By the end of this video, you'll understand why thousands of German POWs chose to stay in America after the war, why many wrote letters home, describing their captivity as the best years of their lives, and how the American treatment of prisoners became one of the most powerful weapons against Nazi ideology, one that Hitler's regime never saw coming. Let me paint you a picture of what happened when the first German POWs arrived at American camps in 1943. Friedrich Krause, a 22-year-old Wehrmacht soldier captured in North Africa, later described his arrival at Camp Hearn in Texas. We expected to be beaten, starved, worked to death. Instead, an American officer greeted us in perfect German, asked if we needed medical attention, and handed us Red Cross packages filled with chocolate, cigarettes, and coffee. But this was just the beginning of their shock. The first thing that left German POWs speechless wasn't just the food, though that was incredible enough. Picture this. Men who had been living on black bread and turnip soup for months, suddenly faced with cafeteria-style meals where they could choose what to eat. American POW camps served portions larger than what many German civilians were getting back home. But here's what really broke their minds: the waste. Georg Weber, a former panzer commander, wrote in his diary, "I watched American guards throw away more food in one day than my family had seen in weeks back in Hamburg. Entire loaves of white bread in the garbage, meat left on plates. I thought surely this was all for show, to make us soft before the real treatment began. The real treatment never came. Instead, something even more shocking happened. The Americans gave them something the Nazi regime had told them Americans could never understand: dignity." Now here's where this story gets really interesting, and why what these POWs experienced would haunt the Nazi leadership. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were supposed to be treated humanely, but the Germans knew they had flagrantly violated these rules with Allied prisoners. They expected reciprocal treatment, eye for an eye. Instead, they got something that challenged everything they'd been taught about American character. Hans Müller, captured at Normandy, described his processing. "They asked my name, rank, and serial number, exactly as required by international law. When I told them I was an officer, they saluted me. A black American soldier saluted me, a German who had been taught that his race was inferior. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about Americans crumbled. But it gets even more mind-bending. The Americans did something that would have been unthinkable in German camps. They let the prisoners organize themselves. German POWs were allowed to elect their own camp leaders, maintain their military hierarchy, and even continue their military traditions, as long as they didn't conflict with camp rules. Camp Alva in Oklahoma became famous among German POWs for something extraordinary. They were allowed to build their own theaters, organize orchestras, and even create their own newspapers. The camp newspaper, Der Ruf, The Call, was written entirely by German prisoners and distributed throughout the American camp system. Here's the kicker. These newspapers began to question Nazi ideology, not because Americans forced them to, but because the stark contrast between what they were experiencing and what they had been told created an intellectual crisis. Werner Burkert, a former SS officer, wrote, "How could the degenerate Americans create a system more civilized than our own? How could they show mercy to their enemies when we had shown none to theirs?" But what happened next was the real game changer, and it's something that would make Nazi leaders lose sleep if they knew the full extent of it. The Americans offered German POWs something revolutionary: education, not propaganda. Not indoctrination, real education. By 1944, American prison camps had become universities. German prisoners could take courses in everything from engineering to philosophy, taught by fellow prisoners who were professors, doctors, and intellectuals. The Americans provided books, materials, and even accredited programs. Klaus Becker, a former Luftwaffe pilot, enrolled in a mechanical engineering program at Camp Crossville in Tennessee. He later said, "I learned more about democratic principles in that prison camp than I had learned about anything in 12 years of Nazi education. And the Americans never once told us we had to think a certain way. Here's what's absolutely incredible. The literacy rate among German POWs actually increased during their captivity. Men who had been pulled out of school to fight were now getting university-level education, courtesy of their captors. But the most shocking part? The Americans allowed German prisoners access to uncensored news. For the first time in years, these men could read newspapers, listen to radio broadcasts, and hear different perspectives about the war. They learned about the Holocaust, something many claimed they had never fully understood while serving. They read about German war crimes. They saw evidence of what their country had done to Allied prisoners. Wolfgang Fischer wrote to his family, "Everything we were told about the war, about our enemies, about our own actions, it was all lies. The Americans showed us the truth not by forcing it on us, but by simply making it available." Now, here's where the story takes an even more incredible turn. Under international law, POWs could be required to work, but not in war production. The Americans put German prisoners to work in farms, forests, and construction projects across the United States. But here's what left the Germans absolutely stunned. They were paid for their work, not much by American standards, about 80 cents a day. But for men who expected slave labor, this was revolutionary. More importantly, they were paid the same wages as American workers doing similar jobs. Otto Kramer, working on a farm in Nebraska, described the experience. "The American farmer who employed me treated me better than my own officers had treated me in the Wehrmacht. He invited me to eat meals with his family. His children played with me. When I made a mistake, he taught me the correct way instead of screaming or punishing me. But here's the detail that will blow your mind. Many German POWs were working alongside American civilians who had no guards, no supervision, nothing stopping these prisoners from escaping if they wanted to. They didn't escape. In fact, the escape rate from American POW camps was less than 1%. Compare that to the 5–10% escape rate from German camps holding Allied prisoners. Why didn't they run? Rudolf Steinberg explained it simply. Where would we go? Back to a country in ruins? Back to a regime that had lied to us about everything? Many of us had found something in America we had never experienced in Germany. Respect. The work programs created something the American government hadn't anticipated. A massive propaganda victory. German POWs were writing letters home describing America as a land of abundance, opportunity, and fairness. These letters were being read by German civilians who were experiencing bombing, starvation, and Nazi repression. But what happened next challenged both American and German assumptions about war, race, and human nature. Despite regulations forbidding fraternization, genuine friendships began forming between German prisoners and American guards, workers, and civilians. The story of Heinrich Weber and Sergeant Thomas Johnson became legendary in several camps. Johnson, an African-American guard from Detroit, initially hated his assignment, watching over men who had fought for a regime that considered his race subhuman. Weber, a former Hitler youth leader, had been taught that African Americans were inferior beings. Their first conversation happened during a medical emergency when Weber collapsed from heat exhaustion while working. Johnson carried him to the infirmary and stayed with him through the night. Weber later wrote, "This man, whom I had been taught to despise, showed me more human kindness than my own officers ever had. He talked to me about his family, his dreams of becoming a teacher after the war, his love of jazz music. I realized that everything I had been taught about race was not just wrong, it was evil." When Johnson was transferred to another camp, Weber requested permission to write to him. The friendship lasted for decades after the war. But here's the most incredible part. These friendships were happening everywhere. German prisoners were being invited to American homes for dinner. They were attending local churches. They were forming relationships that crossed every line the war had drawn. Mary Patterson, a farmer's wife in Iowa, described having German POWs work on their farm. "At first, I was terrified. These were the enemy, but after a few weeks I realized they were just young men, far from home, scared and confused. We started inviting them for Sunday dinner. By the end of the war, they felt like family. Now, here's where this story reaches its emotional climax, and where the true impact of American treatment becomes clear. By 1945, as news of Germany's surrender reached the camps, something unprecedented happened. Instead of celebration, many German POWs experienced what psychologists would later call an identity crisis. They had spent years being told they were fighting for the master race, for German superiority, for a 1,000-year Reich. Instead, they had discovered that their inferior captors possessed qualities their own system lacked: compassion, fairness, and genuine civilization. Karl-Heinz Hackbarth wrote what became known as the Letter, a document circulated secretly among German POWs that articulated what many were feeling. "We came to America as soldiers of the Reich, believing ourselves superior. We leave as men who have seen what true civilization looks like. How do we return to a country that taught us to hate when we have experienced love? How do we face families who still believe the lies when we have lived the truth?" The psychological impact was so severe that American camp psychiatrists began studying what they called reverse indoctrination syndrome, German prisoners who had become psychologically unable to identify with Nazi ideology. But here's the most shocking statistic. When given the opportunity to return to Germany, over 5,000 German POWs requested permission to stay in America permanently. These requests were denied. All prisoners had to be repatriated, but the desire was so strong that many began planning to return to America as soon as legally possible. What happened next created a problem for both German and American authorities, though for very different reasons. German POWs were allowed to write letters home, but these letters had to be censored by both American and German authorities. The problem was that the prisoners were writing about their experiences in ways that completely contradicted Nazi propaganda. Ernst Floeder wrote to his wife, "Marta, everything we were told about Americans was wrong. They have given me medical care better than what German officers received at home. They have fed me better than you have been fed. They treat me with respect and dignity. How can they be our enemies when they act more like our friends than our own government ever did?" Such letters created a crisis for German censors. They couldn't allow them through uncensored. They contradicted everything the Nazi regime was telling the German people about American brutality. But they couldn't simply stop all mail from POWs without raising questions. The solution was to heavily censor the letters, often reducing them to simple statements like, "I am well and I miss home." But German families began to read between the lines. If their sons and husbands were merely well after years in American captivity, it suggested they weren't being tortured or murdered as Nazi propaganda claimed. This created what intelligence historians called the Silent Propaganda War, a battle for German hearts and minds, fought not through speeches or broadcasts, but through the simple truth of how America treated its prisoners. American intelligence began to recognize the strategic value of humane treatment. General Eisenhower reportedly said, "Every German prisoner who returns home knowing he was treated fairly becomes an ambassador for American values." By the time repatriation began in 1946, something extraordinary had happened to hundreds of thousands of German POWs. They had undergone what could only be described as a complete worldview transformation, not through force or coercion, but through experience. Dr. Maxwell McKnight, a psychiatrist who studied German POWs, documented what he called the American effect. These men had experienced a form of government and society that contradicted everything they had been taught. They had seen democracy in action, not as a theory, but as a lived reality that included them despite their enemy status. The transformation was so complete that when German prisoners were finally loaded onto ships for repatriation, many wept openly, not from joy at going home, but from sorrow at leaving America. Hans-Peter Kretschmer described the scene. As we sailed past the Statue of Liberty, heading back to a Germany we no longer recognized, many of us realized we were leaving our hearts in America. We had come as enemies and were leaving as men who understood what freedom really meant. But here's the most incredible part of this story: the long-term impact. What happened to these German POWs after they returned home became one of the most powerful forces for democratic transformation. In post-war Germany, many of the men who had experienced American prison camps became leaders in building democratic institutions in West Germany. They became teachers, politicians, businessmen, and community leaders who carried with them an understanding of democratic values learned in captivity. Werner von Braun, though not a POW himself, worked closely with many former prisoners who joined the American space program. He noted, "These men understood America in ways that Germans who had never been here could not. They had lived American values from the inside. The ripple effects were generational. Children of former POWs grew up hearing stories not of American brutality, but of American fairness and opportunity. This created a foundation of pro-American sentiment in Germany that lasted throughout the Cold War. But perhaps most importantly, these men became living proof that enemies could become friends, that hatred could be transformed into understanding, and that civilization was measured not by how you treated your friends, but by how you treated your enemies." Franz Müller, writing in 1985 on the 40th anniversary of his capture, said America won the war not just with bombs and bullets, but with something more powerful: the simple decision to treat their enemies as human beings worthy of dignity and respect. Here's what makes this story even more incredible: the American government didn't initially plan this as a propaganda strategy. The decision to treat German POWs humanely was made simply because it was the right thing to do under international law and American values. The transformative effect was an unintended consequence that became one of America's greatest strategic victories. Soviet intelligence, studying American POW camps, reported back to Moscow with alarm. The Americans are turning German prisoners into advocates for democracy. This represents a more serious threat to communist expansion than military force. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. German prisoners in Soviet camps experienced brutality, starvation, and death. Those who survived returned to Germany as broken men with horror stories that drove many Germans toward the West. German prisoners in American camps returned as ambassadors for democratic values, carrying with them proof that the American way of life wasn't just propaganda, it was real. As we reach the end of this incredible story, let's reflect on what we've learned. Over 400,000 German prisoners of war discovered something in American prison camps that left them speechless. Not cruelty or revenge, but dignity, opportunity, and respect. They found education instead of indoctrination, friendship instead of hatred, and hope instead of despair. They discovered that their enemies possessed the very qualities their own regime claimed to represent: civilization, order, and human dignity. But perhaps most importantly, they learned that strength isn't measured by how brutally you can treat those in your power, but by how humanely you choose to treat them instead. This story challenges us to think about our own times, our own conflicts, and our own choices about how we treat those we disagree with, or even those we consider enemies. The German POWs who experienced American camps became living proof that minds can be changed, that enemies can become friends, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply treating people with the dignity they deserve as human beings. What do you think? How does this story change your understanding of World War II? Iki siwis me, of America's role in the war? Of the power of treating enemies with dignity? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story moved you the way it moved me, please share it with others. History has so many lessons to teach us, but only if we're willing to listen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll explore another untold story from World War II that will challenge everything you thought you knew about this incredible period in human history. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell because history's greatest stories are waiting to be told.